Hello and welcome to the podcast 10 Lessons That Took 50 Years to Learn, where we dispense wisdom, not just cliches, platitudes, or banalities, to an international audience of rising leaders. My name is Duff Watkins and I'm your host. Our guest today is Professor Emeritus of Boston University, Andrew Bacevich. Welcome, Andrew. Welcome to the show.
Thanks very much.
Now, I want to say to the listeners, Professor Bacevich is an expert in military history and international relations, but he's not some sort of armchair academic guy sitting in an ivory hall mailing it in, because as I know, Andrew, you're a graduate of the Military Academy of the United States, West Point, which is no mean achievement in and of itself. You were a career military officer. You worked overseas. You've been in combat. You have walked the talk. You retired as a colonel. So you're not some sort of armchair academic, is what I'm trying to say. And you are. This is my favorite description of you. You are described as a persistent vocal critic of the United States. And to which I thought, well, I should hope so, because you actually know whereof you speak about these things. Okay, you're an American historian. Lesson number one: the historian's duty is to revise history. Wait a minute. I thought the historian's job was to record history.
Well, my first serious encounter with history was when I went to graduate school. Mm-hmm. This is back in the middle of the 1970s. I was a serving Army officer. The Army officer sent me to graduate school to prepare me to teach history at West Point for a couple of years. And I must say that when I showed up in the Princeton campus, I thought that history was something that you memorized. I figured that all I needed to do to get my degree was to, read a handful of books and absorb what they said. Why did the Civil War occur? And then to regurgitate that for my cadets when I became a teacher. What I found was something quite different. And that is, history really is an argument. Each generation poses its own questions of the past, mm-hmm. to the past. Questions that each generation deems to be relevant to contemporary concerns. And therefore, each generation ought to come up with its own answers, mm-hmm. with regard to what history means. I think we are experiencing that today in a very vivid way, and that has to do with the place of racism as part of our collective story, part of American history. When I was going to graduate school, the historical profession, the professors that I studied with, who taught me, were in the process, I think, of coming to a revised understanding of how race fit into the larger narrative. And I must tell you, mm-hmm. Given my upbringing at that time, I don't think I was particularly responsive to the new questions that they were asking and the new answers that they were coming up with regard to race. Mm-hmm. 40 or so years later, I can understand that those questions were necessary, and I may not agree with the way we have come to interpret the place of race in American history, but I think it's been invaluable. Mm-hmm. So again, the questions change, the answers change, and I think what makes history exciting is that it ends up being a never-ending argument. Mm-hmm. Not necessarily the way the public sees history, but I think the way the public ought to see history.
Mm-hmm. So I guess my takeaway from that is the history is continually being reinterpreted, but also re-experienced. I think somebody said the past is re-experienced. It's not even the past. I mean, it's right. The present, really.
Right. Mm. I think that's exactly right. I mean, I read an article over the weekend, an essay by historian teaching at Oxford, Martin Conway. Never heard of the guy before. Conway, the point of Conway's argument, of his essay, was to argue that about the meaning of the Trump phenomenon. I think there's a tendency among not all Americans, many Americans, sort of breathe a sigh of relief that Trump is out of office, that our new president is restoring a sense of normalcy to American politics. Biden is a very conventional politician. He's a middle-of-the-road guy. He is a senior citizen who, not to be unfair, but doesn't seem likely to really shake things up too much. And I think for many Americans after Trump, that's just what they want. What this guy is arguing is that the significance of Trump lies not in anything that he did, any policy decisions that he made. The significance of Trump is the fact that we elected him.
Yes.
That the American people chose this, what should we say, non-politician, unqualified for high office, either by experience or by temperament. And what he's suggesting is that the election of Donald Trump in 2016 and the fact that he got 74 million votes in 2020 is suggestive of a change in the American people where, in a sense, the American people are now posing new questions about the past. He argues, that history as we know it, call it the history of the 20th century, that history has ended. That we have now embarked upon a new historical era, which we don't come remotely close to understanding. But, he argues, to maintain the pretense that the history of the 20th century, as we understand it, is still legitimate or valid, is going to lead to enormous disappointment. So the charge is to embark upon an inquiry as to what is the content or meaning of this new historical era. It's a fascinating piece. And it obviously reinforces my own biases.
Well, I'm just about to say, I've heard some of this before because I just finished I believe it's your most recent book, The Age of Illusions. Now, readers, listeners, I want to say, years ago, I read an article, one of your articles in Atlantic, New York Times, Washington Post. So I called this mate of mine in North Carolina. I said, I just read this interesting article. I got to send it to you. And he said, yeah, I read Bacevich stuff all the time. So then I bought one book, two books, three books. I read several of your books, most recently, The Age of Illusions. And I want to say, readers, listeners, you want to check out Andrew's books because, one, they're really thin and they don't take forever to read. They're very cogent, very lucid. Every word counts. And I find myself agreeing with the analysis over and over again. And when I didn't, it sure as hell made me think. So, I mean, that is a great, if you're not really into history, you will be when you read some of Andrew's books. The Age of Illusions is the one I just finished. Okay, that takes us to point number 2. Thinking of yourself or your country as exceptional is the big lie that imprisons you. Now, you're going to get in a lot of trouble in the US if you say that. I got to tell you, because American exceptionalism is a religion over there, and you sound like a heretic.
Well, it is heresy, I think. Actually, the second topic, I think, follows on from the first. So I was born in 1947, right after World War II. Both my parents, World War II veterans, and proud. Conservative Catholic family, still a Catholic. Both my parents, especially my mom, deeply patriotic. God bless her soul. But I have to say, in retrospect, from my perspective, uncritically patriotic. Her history, my dad's too, but in particular my mom's, her history centered on World War II. That was the fountain from which so much of her understanding of the world flowed. And it was a heroic story. And I don't want to come across as arguing. It was a heroic story. I happened to be reading just now. I'd seen the movie, but I never read the book. Cornelius Ryan's famous history of D-Day, The Longest Day. I can't say that I'm learning anything that I didn't know, but by golly, am I being reminded of the courage of the GIs who embarked upon that treacherous undertaking. It made an important contribution to the liberation of Western Europe and to the creation of the post-war world that I grew up in. On the other hand, guess what? The Soviets killed a hell of a lot more Germans than we did. The Soviets, Joseph Stalin, probably killed about as many people, murdered about as many people as Adolf Hitler did. Stalin wasn't fighting for liberalism and democracy and freedom.
No.
But he was a crucial ally. So American exceptionalism tends to want to frame World War II as a liberating event where America stepped forth from the Western Hemisphere to save civilization. That's the way my mom viewed it. That's the way I viewed it growing up. And that is a sort of narrative that then underwrites the claims of American exceptionalism. I mean, who else would do what we did in coming to the aid of Great Britain and then liberating Western Europe? And if all you know about history, then American exceptionalism is pretty easy to buy into. But guess what? As my little foray into reminding about this, so it's a lot more complicated than that. And the older I've gotten, the more I've come to believe that the effects of American exceptionalism on us are pernicious. And I think we saw that with enormous clarity in the wake of 9/11. You remember, a treacherous, murderous act. You know, we didn't deserve it. We didn't ask for it. George W. Bush, you know, who would have wanted to be George W. Bush on the evening of September 11th, 2001, when you have to go on television and you have to explain to the American people what happened on your watch and what now you intend to do about it. He too was not prepared to be president. But what was his response? His response, framed over the next few weeks, was to embark upon a global war on terrorism against an axis of evil. Axis of evil compared to the Axis of the early 1940s. Promises to eliminate, explicit promises to eliminate evil from the face of the earth. Explicit promises to not only eliminate terrorism, but to bring about the transformation of the Middle East, spreading liberalism and democracy. And that became the argument in favor of going to war, and specifically launching the Iraq War of 2003. In other words, what framed the Iraq War was less serious, thoughtful, strategic planning. It was ideology. It was the ideology of American exceptionalism.
It was a conceit, a fabulous conceit.
Absolutely.
I mean,
and to my mind, the result was catastrophe.
Yeah.
To some degree, the result was Donald Trump. I mean, people voted for Donald Trump for all kinds of reasons, but in my judgment, one of those reasons was that a large number of Americans were sick and tired of the wars that had been undertaken pursuant to this global war on terrorism. So there's an argument to be made that American exceptionalism served us well for a time. If you look at the Mexican War of 1846, 1848, Mexican War was a war of aggression by the United States directed against the Republic of Mexico, justified by claims of manifest destiny. That is to say, some kind of a providential claim that it was incumbent upon us to spread freedom out to the Pacific coast. So we go to war with Mexico, we take California, we confirm the annexation of Texas, we bring the Southwest into the Union. I don't regret that. I don't feel bad that we basically stole California from Mexico. I don't buy the justification of manifest destiny any longer. But I have to say that if you're looking for how is it that the United States of America, created in 1776, small, weak, kind of huddled along the Atlantic coast, how do we get from there to 1945 to become the richest and most powerful nation on the planet? American exceptionalism, used, for example, in the Mexican War, provides an explanation for how all that happened. The problem in my mind is, okay, this kind of goes back to we're now living a new history. So here we are in 2021. It's not clear to me that the claims of American exceptionalism remain valid, or perhaps more to the point, that remain useful to us. That we need to come to a different understanding of who we are as a people, as a nation, in order to accommodate a new reality. After the Cold War, there was a lot of talk about, a unipolar moment. There's only one superpower. The history had, quote unquote, ended. There was no alternative to American-style liberal democracy. I mean, I'm being sarcastic as I say it, but the truth is, for a time, those ideas were taken very, very seriously.
They were. Well, yeah.
They were wrong. They were incorrect. And therefore, what we need now is a different perspective. So it's in that sense that I think if you buy into something like American exceptionalism, it makes it more difficult to understand, who we are, where we need to go next as a nation.
It is, for me, I just can't find the evidence for it anymore. I mean, like you, I come from a military family. You're an Army guy. I was born in a U.S. Marine base. My father was U.S. Marine. I raised in a U.S. Marine town. U.S. Marines buried my father. Have an affinity for the U.S. Marines. But that was then. This is now. Like you, I believed everything I was told until I stepped outside the country and started seeing and observing. So now I just look at the evidence for American exceptionalism and can't find it. Americans are great at manufacturing their own myths, is what I have observed many times.
Oh yeah. I don't think we're unique in that regard.
No.
I mean, do the Swiss have myths about themselves? Maybe so. And it doesn't matter, because Switzerland is not throwing its weight around as a major actor on the global stage. So the negative implications of us buying into a false sense of who we are can cause great harm to ourselves and great harm to others. And again, if I look at the narrative, the military narrative of post 9/11, we did great harm to ourselves and great harm to others.
And that's it. It's the false sense of self that leads to self-harm, and not in the long term, but in the short term, here and now, right, and also in the long term. Point number 4, point number 3, war is uncontrollable. I kind of don't, well, I was going to say, doesn't everybody know that? But actually, what I want to say to most people, especially young people, I think they believe war is a goddamn video game. And now you've seen the reality of it. You know what it's like. You've been there. You've seen stuff explode. I mean, and people die. It's how do you convey that to somebody?
Well, you're making a good point. I mean, if one's conception of war is a video game, conveying a sense of truth about war becomes very, very difficult. Back when I was teaching, I used to teach courses in military history, and I think one of the things I was trying to do was to convey a sense of how, once the political decision makers say go, undertake this, uncertainty takes over, chance takes over. It becomes very difficult to project the course that a war is going to take. And I don't want to keep talking about the Iraq War, but again, a good example, illustrative example, where we undertook this war to overthrow the Saddam Hussein regime. We knew Saddam was not particularly popular, ruthless dictator, but we knew his army was weak. We'd beat up his army back in 1991. Whole country had been under severe sanctions ever since. So the military task of overthrowing Saddam was not expected to be all that difficult, and it wasn't all that difficult. The problem happened with what happened next. The uncontrollable part of the war happened when both senior U.S. commanders and American politicians thought that the war was over. It was supposed to end with the overthrow of the Saddam Hussein regime. Instead, what we got was a civil war compounded by an insurgency with U.S. forces struggling to impose a sense of order, finding the troops finding themselves called upon to fight a war radically different from the war they had expected. They'd expected a war of, tanks and fighter planes against organized formations that had their own tanks and fighter planes. But we ended up fighting insurgents. I mean, the physical environment was radically different from Southeast Asia, but the nature of the war resembled the war that we fought in Southeast Asia back in the 1960s and into the 1970s. And we learned then that we're not particularly, the U.S. forces are not particularly adept at dealing with insurgencies. So, there is a tendency in some quarters, I wouldn't say it's necessarily young people today, and these are in terms of political labels, it's people on the right, it's people on the left. On the left, it's the humanitarians. There's terrible things going on right now in Myanmar. And there will inevitably we need to intervene there in Myanmar. We need to clobber the Burmese army. We need to put a democratic order in place and fix this. It turns out to be a lot harder than that. So I just think it's one of those, when you've become a grown-up and you're trying to understand the difference between what even a powerful nation like ours can do and what it should refrain from doing. It seems to me that what's important is to be very wary of war. Don't kid yourself that war is going to provide a cheap and easy solution to a complex problem. There are times when war is necessary. But I think that the prudent statesman recognizes that those situations, those circumstances don't occur all the time.
Point number 4, to fear ideology is irrational.
So when I was growing up, talking 1950s America.
I was there.
Cold War, early Cold War. Clearly defined demarcation between our side and their side. Free world against the slave world. And one of the things that made them, the other side, dangerous was that they had a different belief system. What do we want to call it? Communism, Marxism, Leninism. In China, Maoism, as opposed to liberal democracy, or more simply, freedom on our side.
Sounds better.
So I very much grew up in an environment in which Marxism, the belief system, was considered dangerous. I remember when I was growing up, and this is I was probably like 5 or 6 years old. People had radios on, and you just barely beginning to interpret what the news was about. In the news, people would talk about communism a lot. And I remember that at first I thought communism was probably a disease. That it was something that if you caught it, you were going to get very, very, very sick. It took me a while to figure out it wasn't a disease. It was an ideology, it was a perspective, it was a set of ideas. But I recall the anecdote because it remains a reminder to me that I don't think ideas are dangerous. I think maybe it's what's dangerous is to be persuaded that your ideas, that the American ideas are definitive, are right for us and are right for them, are right for all times. And so here we are. I would say that today there's an interesting theme in American politics where this is maybe the Bernie Sanders camp. There's a flirtation with socialism, not with Marxism, Leninism, not with, but there's, people, maybe there's something to be said for socialism. Here we are, a country that in the aggregate level, we're rich, we have enormous poverty, enormous inequality. And people like Bernie Sanders and others in the progressive camp, I guess we choose to, maybe there's something to socialism that we should consider. Back in the 1950s, if you said socialism, you'd be branding yourself a communist. So I think, I myself have come to be, I'm not a socialist, but I have come to be a lot more willing to learn about, consider the possibility of ideological alternatives. Or maybe to put it this way, I'm no longer persuaded that there is a one-size-fits-all ideology. I don't approve of, nobody's asked me to approve of, the Communist Party's rule in the People's Republic of China. I recognize that it's an authoritarian government. I recognize that the Chinese people are denied all kinds of freedoms that I cherish. I get as upset as anybody else when we see the kind of repression that occurs in Hong Kong when young Chinese in particular demonstrate on behalf of their freedom. All of that said, I'm not persuaded at this point that the United States of America, from an ideological perspective, has the answer for China. If they would only embrace our ideology, our values, that all would be well. I'm more inclined to say, maybe China's a different place than the United States.
I talked to a
Maybe
Chinese.
they need to be able to follow their own path.
I talked to a Chinese guy in Australia who told me, he said he lived under communism. He said, it's not so bad. And I was absolutely astonished. My mind almost, I never considered the possibility. Lesson number 5, my personal favorite, my absolute personal favorite. Never feel sorry for the people in charge. Wait a minute. Are you saying I shouldn't feel empathy, sympathy for all those CEOs and corporate executives and leaders who are when they lose their revenue streams, or when they lose an election and they lose their access to power, I shouldn't just weep for them?
No, we shouldn't. I mean, you know, they got to where they are because they wanted to be there. You know, they acquired power, you know, wealth, influence, celebrity, because that's what they wanted. They I don't know how, if it's conscious or not, but I mean, they defined their life's purpose in terms of ascending some greasy pole.
Mm-hmm.
And most people don't get to the top, and some people do. You know, as you and I speak, Governor Cuomo of New York State is being pilloried by the press because of accusations of sexual harassment being lodged against him by a couple of women who I think who were in his employ as governor. I don't frankly know all the details, nor am I making any judgment about the details. But he's having some tough days right now. Well, you know, everybody has tough days. and if he didn't want to be governor of New York and, you know, be exposed, as it were, to all this media attention, he could have done something else with his life. So I don't feel sorry for the people in charge. I recognize that when you're in charge, there's always going to be people who are hoping to see you fall flat on your face. I think that's something of what's going on with Governor Cuomo right now. He's not a pleasant character, as best I can tell. And there are some in the press, I guess even in his own party, that are more than happy to see him get his comeuppance. But you know, that's part of that's the way the game is played. Right now, President Biden, to my view, is getting a bunch of sweetheart treatment from the press. Well, guess what? That won't last forever.
No.
And frankly, he probably knows it. He's been around long enough to know that you don't take too seriously positive press coverage. So, you know, I just don't feel sorry for the people in charge.
Nor do I. I will say, I mean, I do have a respect because they do what it takes to get there. When I say respect, I don't mean support or affirmation. They do what it takes to get there, and by God, they'll do whatever it takes to stay there. And so to me, that resonates. So that's one reason why I don't feel sorry. I never have felt sorry. I never will feel sorry for them.
Well, you know, you're reminding me, there's a famous essay, I think, by Theodore Roosevelt, where he talks about the courage of the man in the arena. For him, it's a man.
Of course.
You know, the person who has the gumption, the courage to offer himself or herself for consideration. Give me your votes. Is willing to risk rejection, the humiliation of rejection. And there's something to that. It does take courage to seek these positions. And one should acknowledge that. But when things don't go right, you know, I'm not going to be shedding tears for them.
Lesson number 6, the greatest sin of all is the lack of empathy for others. That sounds like a good Catholic speaking.
Well, I don't know if I'm a good Catholic, but I think I've come to know myself well enough to understand that that's a personal failing of mine, that not to to be so focused on some larger purpose, which more often than not ends up being personal ambition, that you fail to attend to what the people around you are feeling, what they need. I think parents do this. They're absorbed with their professional life, don't give the kids the attention that they deserve. But I think it happens in a professional setting as well. When the emphasis on getting the job done, come on, we got to get the job done, then I think that can easily result in not attending to the needs of the people who are trying to get that job done. And I just know that in my earlier life, when I had professional responsibilities, that was a failing of mine. Too bad somebody didn't tell me then. Of course, if they had, I probably would have said, "Oh, come on."
Yeah.
But I do think that I regret that my lack of empathy.
I must tell you this story. I used to work as a psychotherapist in Sydney, and I was attending a course on emotional intelligence, and there was a woman leading it. And I said something, this came up, and I said something, well, yeah, except in the military, when they give you a mission, they give you a task, and you take that hill, and, they don't ask for a show of hands, or who wants to go first, and, how does everybody feel about it? They simply tell you, you do it, it's a mission. And she said to me, she said, "Duff, I work with the military all the time, and they tell me over and over and over again, those are the worst officers they deal with. Those are the worst." And a light went on for me, Andrew, and I confirming what you say. I mean, human empathy, there is no substitute, there's no replacement for it. And even in the military, and you know far better than me, it's not optional, it is a requirement for leadership.
I agree, and again, in retrospect, I wish I had manifested more than I did, but everybody's got their own sins.
That takes us to lesson number 7. Ambition causes blindness. Now, you're a career military guy, and correct me if I'm wrong.
Long ago now. I mean, decades
ago.
A
while ago, yeah. And in the military, it's up and out. I believe it was then. I believe it still is now. And
pretty much, yep.
You don't get to be a colonel by accident in the United States Army. You have to do a lot of things right and a lot of things that are expected, I guess. So, so tell me more. How ambition causes blindness?
That's I think in a way it's the flip side of the empathy point. And you're right. The ambition that is promoted by the military profession is ambition that focuses on getting the job done. The mission, whatever the mission is. I mean, in combat, it might be taking the hill. You're working in the Pentagon, it might be to complete some kind of study for some 4-star general in the next 2 weeks and to brief it and get it right. But it's hard also to separate this determination to get the job done from your own personal ambitions. Because if you complete that staff study and you're able to make a persuasive presentation to the 4-star general in the Pentagon, not only will that study produce a positive outcome, we hope, so it's also going to make the 4-star general think well of you. So I think that the mission orientation, we're talking about the military. I don't think it's just in the military.
No, it's not.
It's the same thing. If you're
working
for Amazon,
corporate world,
you're working, that the mission orientation camouflages ambition and probably contributes to not being sufficiently attentive to the needs of people who may be lower than you are on the totem pole. Even though, as you suggested in your anecdote, being attentive to the people lower in the totem pole can actually play an invaluable role in getting the mission done. Because they believe the boss, if the boss cares about me, then I'm going to do my darndest to make sure the boss succeeds. Not simply doing it because the boss gave me an order, but because I believe in the boss, and therefore I believe in the boss's mission. Now, as I say this to you, I say, we're here to talk about wisdom. I say, that's not wisdom. That's like the most obvious thing in the whole world.
Now,
that's right. Those are the sorts of things that are much more difficult to discern, I think, when you're young. Now, some people get them right away. I was always a slow learner. So,
well, you're actually righter than you think in terms of neuropsychology. Ambition, over focus, over learning actually does constrict your attention, so that you literally, your attention is narrow, your concentration is narrow. That's not a bad thing necessarily, but what it means is you will miss, you will overlook, you will not see some probably very important things that are happening, that are coming at you. You might be looking here when you should be looking there. You might be so focused on, you might not see that the goals have changed, as you were saying, you know. You're so consumed with your own inner needs that you haven't noticed that people in the team have needs as well. So
right, I think that's true. Yep.
Oh, number 8. Let's number 8. Oh boy, here we go. Social media is inherently evil.
So I'm a guy. I'm not on Facebook. I'm not on Twitter. I'm not on any of that stuff. I do not have a smartphone. My wife has a smartphone, so when we go someplace, you know, we can maintain communications with our kids and so on. But and it seems to me that the evidence is clear. Well, two things are clear. First is that this social media it takes over your life. I mean, you forfeit your autonomy. Even though I don't do all that stuff on my phone, when you and I are done talking, I'm looking at you on my laptop. When you and I are done talking, first thing I'm going to do is check my email. Because during the course of our conversation of roughly an hour, I have not checked my email. And I can feel the need to do so. I'm uneasy that I haven't checked my email.
It's visceral.
And I think, I think I have kind of a mild case of this disease. You know, the kids who cannot have their phone out of their hands and who are, you know, checking their Facebook page. I mean, I think there's data on this. Hundreds of times a day are addicted. Again, I think I have I am not immune, but I think I have I have a mild case because I don't do Facebook or Twitter or all those things. So that's problem number 1. Problem number 2 is the way that social media just coarsens the discourse. It brings out the worst in us. You know, to snap back at someone or some opinion, not in ways that somehow expands the amount of wisdom in the world or advances mutual understanding, but just sort of settles scores. And that too, for me, is a reason why I just don't want to do that. I just don't want to be part of that. So I'm holding out.
There are studies which say that misinformation, false information, gets transmitted faster and further on Twitter. These are the studies I'm referring to, than than truth, than reality. And I wasn't surprised by this. What you're describing, I mean, frankly, it is very problematic when I see kids, kids being anybody younger than me nowadays. But they, it is the famous phrase by Neil Postman is amusing ourselves to death, seeking the constant stimulation of not participating but observing something. And it just blows my mind. And lesson number 9, a Beatles song, no less. Money can't buy you love.
Well, it's true.
I haven't tried yet, so I don't know.
I think I think that the statement applies beyond the United States, but I think it applies in particular in America, that ours is an acquisitive, materialistic culture, prizes, consumption. We tend not to be satisfied with what we have. We tend to think that if we just had more, a bigger house, a newer car, vacation place on the Cape, that somehow life would be better. And I think that's pretty much a delusion. There's lots of people who have, quote unquote, more. The billionaires and the celebrities, and I mean, the ones we know about are the celebrities, and it doesn't seem like that being a celebrity is necessarily a path to happiness. Most of them seem to be afflicted in some way or another. So I mean, again, because you're talking to somebody who, relative to probably 95% of the population on planet Earth, you're talking to somebody who actually is quite comfortable. We don't live in a mansion, but we live in a nice house. Since we don't live in Texas, we're not worried about losing our power for days on end. The furnace keeps us warm in the wintertime, and the AC keeps us cool in the summertime. Once the pandemic is past, God willing, we'll go out to eat when we want to go out to eat. We won't go to the fanciest restaurants in Boston, but we'll go wherever we want to go. So from, in a material sense, our family, we are privileged. There's no question about that. My point simply is that you get to a position in terms of your physical security and well-being. Just trying to get more is not going to make it any better. Matter of fact, I think to be satisfied, to be content from a materialistic point of view, maybe that's one of the things that opens up the possibility of a different line of thought about the purpose of your existence. It's not simply to try to get a bigger car. I don't know how many people would take that opportunity, but I do know money can't buy a love.
Well, the Buddhists have nailed this centuries ago. You'll often hear the word, they talk about suffering, people suffering. A better translation of that word is unsatisfied, not dissatisfied, unsatisfied. It's, you get more and more, but is it enough? And it's that that feeling of I'm lacking something. And they say that's a mirage, that's false, that you are enough. And that's the lesson that you really have to get. And I think the antidote for that, at least my own personal experience, is cultivating an attitude of gratitude for whatever the hell you do have. And because that feeling of unsatisfaction can really drive you to do some bizarre things.
Again, I think that, I mean, I'm an old guy. And so the insight that you just offered, I just sort of nod my head and say, yeah, of course that's correct. I don't think I would have said that at age 35. You know, you end up having a different vantage point on things as you age. A different vantage point on what matters.
Lesson number 10. This is a very personal one for me. You say, if you want to stay married, take long walks together with your partner. And I gotta say, okay, and when I'm my wife, we go out walking on the beach, we go out walking in the park where we live, and I take the audio book on the MP3, and she says, "Don't even think about turning that on." I said, "Wait a minute, baby. It's an audio book. It's a book by Andrew Bacevich. Come on, And she doesn't care. She doesn't want to. When you go for those long walks, it's all about communication and being in the here and now. And so, from my personal experience, you're onto something here. Want to stay married? Take long walks with your partner. Tell us more.
Well, I'm with your wife. And we don't always walk together. When my wife walks by herself, she's putting something in her ear to listen to news or music or whatever. When I walk by myself, I don't do that. When I walk by myself, to me, that's the time when my mind wanders in a productive sense. If I'm working on an essay or a book, it's when I'm walking by myself that the pieces of the puzzle fit together. Oh yeah, okay, I can see now where this chapter is supposed to go. And if I were sitting here in front of my computer, staring at that incomplete chapter, knowing I have a problem, I'll waste an incredible amount of time. It's when I walk away from it. When you walk together, and we've been married more than 50 years now, there's nothing to do except to talk to one another. And it's not that you talk to one another to say, let us discuss what we think is the meaning of life. It's ordinary things. What do you want to have for dinner? Have you talked to so-and-so lately? Did you see that card? Ordinary things. But I think we have found that those conversations, even if at a superficial level they're ordinary, is a different level in which they affirm intimacy and partnership. We remind one another through those moments that we are a couple. And frankly, for the two of us, there's like nothing more important than the fact that we are and have been a couple. So it's nurturing, I think, in ways that in a way it's kind of hard to explain. Give me a break. You go for a walk, and that's like a big deal. The answer is yeah, it's a big deal. So I think we both have come to believe that it's one of the best things you can do to maintain a relationship. Get away from the hubbub, get away from the internet, get away from Facebook. Just go outside, breathe some fresh air, walk for about an hour, talk to one another.
And you use the word remind yourself and each other that you're in this relationship. And you think, okay, 50 years, you need a reminder. Well, actually, the answer may be yes, but we need constant reminder. There needs to be a continual process. But your work, your comment about walking, not listening, thinking about work, and things just happen, remind me of Thoreau's comment, trust no thought arrived at while sitting down. I think that's what he said.
That's good.
Yeah, I think it's true. I mean, there are a lot of walking meditations that things just occur to you when you're out there hoofing around by yourself, and that's a good thing. Let me finish with one last question. We've been talking about things that you've learned. Let me ask you about something that you've unlearned, something you absolutely positively knew to be true then, but now Now that you're wiser, now you know it's not true, not the case. Can you give me an example of that?
I hadn't thought about this. I think that I have a different view of success and where it sort of fits in my life. You know, I've written or edited, I don't know how many books now, a dozen or so.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks to my agent and my editor, I've sold more books than I ever possibly imagined I would sell. Some of my books have done poorly. Some have done pretty well. A couple have done real well. When I die, they could put on my gravestone, best-selling author, and it would not be a lie. And once upon a time, I thought that, this is post-Army,
Mm-hmm.
that to be a best-selling author, you know, to have a book on the New York Times bestseller list was like the ultimate.
You've arrived. Yes.
And I don't believe that anymore.
Mm.
I mean, I got a new book coming out in the summertime. I will be very grateful if people buy it and it does well. I'll be disappointed if it flops. But I can't say that I'm invested in that.
Mm-hmm.
That measure of my worth the way I once was.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of gone on to other things,
Mm-hmm.
if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. It makes a lot of sense to me. And you're not the first guest to say that about reframing success as you get older. And the pattern that I see among the guests is it becomes less and less material and more internally with an internal locus. I mean, you're writing the book because you want to write a book, not because you want to sell a bunch of books, is what I'm hearing. Mm-hmm. What is the new book's title, by the way? I just finished Age of Illusions, as I mentioned. What's the new one?
It's called After the Apocalypse. That's a dramatic title. And the subtitle is America's Role in a World Transformed.
Mm-hmm.
Again, you mentioned before that some of my books are short. This is I think this is like 165 pages long. It's quite short. I wrote it basically over the summer during the middle of the pandemic. And the argument is that, you know, the pandemic has killed more than 500,000 Americans. Mm-hmm. The economic damage caused by that, the tumult of the Trump presidency, and a couple of other factors. All of these, I'm arguing, are the equivalent of an apocalypse. Mm-hmm. Has, you know, afflicted the American people. And the book tries to say, well, given what we have experienced, this is how our role in the world ought to change, and to some degree must change. That's what it's all about.
Mm-hmm. I look forward to reading that one.
I hope you will.
Yeah, well, count on it as soon as it comes out. And we will finish here on that note. Folks, you've been listening to the podcast 10 Lessons That Took 50 Years to Learn, and our guest today has been Andrew Bacevich. Our producer today is Robert Hosry, and our podcast is sponsored by the Professional Development Forum PDF. They offer social webinars, podcasts, parties, anything you want, everything you need, and it's all free. You can read more about them on their website, professionaldevelopmentforum.org. And how about you, readers, listeners? You can contact us. You can give us some feedback. We want to know what you want to know. Who would you like to talk to? What sort of wisdom would you offer? What sort of guests would you like us to talk to? You can contact us, podcast at 1010lessonslearned.com.